to speak in terms of ideas, concepts. Now that's part of the project of the Enlightenment, is to turn realities into concepts, ideas, and in this way to try and gain control of things. Now, to some extent, we need to get away from that way of thinking to make sense of much that's in the Bible. So, for our purposes, the Old Testament doesn't speak about the concept of ritual impurity. It understands impurity as a power, and a state of being, a power. And that's the way most people think in the world, if I can just say. So, as far as I see it, the Bible's not interested in the idea of impurity, but the power of impurity, the power of God's holiness, the power of righteousness, the power of sin, etc. These are powers. And that's a much more primitive way of thinking, but it's a much more accurate way of thinking. So, for example, most traditional people don't think about sex as an idea, but as a power. Even if we don't think about it that way, that's the way we experience it. Marriage is not an idea, it's a power. Evil is not an idea, it's a power. Good is not an idea, it's a power. If ever you start working in an animist society, and I pray God that some of you will be doing work in the mission fields, if you did missionary work with Aborigines or people in New Guinea or Indonesia or India, that's the world that you need to look into, to think in terms of power, powers, created powers. So impurity is a power, just as holiness is a power. And there are three kinds of ritual impurity. And they all have to do with various kinds of disorder, chaos. So you have good powers that promote order, stability, and you get bad powers that promote instability, disorder, chaos. Impurity is a life-threatening power because it disorders what God has ordered in creation. Now this may be a new way of thinking for you, but it fits very much into the thinking of a postmodern world and a postmodern society, with its tendency to think in terms of environmental terms, and how important then in environmentalism is not the concept of order versus the concept of chaos. First of all, now there are three kinds of ritual impurity. The first of these impurities has to do with what we, and this is a Western way of thinking because it's only we who chop things up into bits and pieces, we put things into categories, and then by putting them into categories, we imagine that's the way things are. So we say, I have my soul and I have my body. We don't just distinguish soul and body, but then we imagine that they are two different things. Okay, so this is a Western way of doing. So the first thing is what we would call physical disorder. What's unclean? Sickness is unclean. Or, to take another case in point, God created men and women to have sexual intercourse and to reproduce. And as part of the process of reproduction, you have menstruation once a month. That's the natural order of things. That's the way God's created. And in itself, menstruation is not unclean, and it's not contrary to the order of creation. But if you have irregular menstruation, so that a woman keeps on bleeding beyond the monthly period, that brings about a state of impurity. So irregular menstruation. Okay, we could have many other examples of that, but you get the basic idea? So first of all, impurity has to do with what we would call natural or physical disorder. Secondly, and we're still on familiar territory here, And I don't think we disagree with this ancient way of thinking. Impurity has to do with moral disorder. So God has not just created a physical order, natural order we'd say, scientific order in creation, but as part of that order you have a moral order. Now this is a very ancient way of thinking, and it's something that's being questioned very much by modern philosophers, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Moral order and moral disorder. So why does adultery make both parties to adultery unclean? It's because it violates not a physical order, a moral order. Now sexual intercourse is natural, so in itself, intercourse between a married man, or a man who's married to one woman, or a woman who's married to another man, is natural. That's sexual intercourse. That's provided it's heterosexual intercourse. But if you have one man who's married to one woman having sexual intercourse with another one, you violate the moral order, which is also, all of these are spiritual orders, by the way. It involves the spiritual realm. Disorder. And it has inevitable consequences. Both parties to the act become unclean. And it's funny because that's the way we feel about it until we're indoctrinated out of it. That's the way it impinges on us in our hearts and in our consciences. Or take another case which is so obvious, murder. God created human beings to live and to promote life. Murder, whatever shape it takes, direct murder to abortion, violates the moral order, but it also violates a physical order. Can you see how our separation of this doesn't really correspond entirely to the way things are? It's the way we have of arranging reality to suit us. So murder produces moral disorder, but also physical disorder. So, for example, in the Old Testament, if a murder is committed here on the campus of Concordia Seminary, that murder not only defiles and contaminates the murderer, but it also defiles and contaminates the whole community, all the people within this community, and it defiles the land on which the murder has occurred. So it impinges on the natural order. Lastly, and this is, by the way, parts of the laws of purity in the book of Leviticus and in Deuteronomy that people have the most difficulty with, and you might want to explore some of this further. The third kind of, in our term, of impurity, third kind of ritual impurity, has to do with religious disorder. Now I find, as I teach the Old Testament and get to Leviticus almost every year, students have difficulty with, why is it that, for example, there's a prohibition of sexual intercourse during menstruation? Why is it that corpses make a person unclean? Why is it that beef and mutton is clean, but pork is unclean? Etc. You can multiply the cases. Let me just take each of these in turn. But what lies behind all of these is that all the things that are declared unclean, or God says are unclean, have to do with occult in some way in the ancient world and still many parts of the world to the present day. They have to do with the way physical things are used for religious, irreligious purposes. So, for example, since you're a bunch of blokes, I'll start off with semen. Why is it that if you have an emission of semen during sexual intercourse, that's okay, there's no problems there, but any other use of semen, even if it is a nocturnal emission, or any other use of semen, renders a person unclean? Well, to make sense of it, you need to put yourself in the shoes of people who live in an animist world. Because for people who are animists, semen is not just semen in a scientific medical sense, but it has life power. What kind of life power does it have? Procreational life power, and it is male life power. So if you suffer from impotence or similar disorders and you want to get virility, how do you borrow virility? You don't have Viagra to buy in the local shop. How do you gain virility? It's through the use of semen. You use semen because it has life power and it has spiritual life power. It obviously has spiritual life power because it creates life, and that's spiritual. So, for example, it's quite common in many parts of the world to the present day in the ancient world that homosexual intercourse, particularly oral ejaculation into the mouth, has religious significance. Can you see another way of it? Because you're getting male life power, or any other way it's used. For our Aboriginal people, one of the substances that they use for sorcery and magic is semen. So it has to do with life, and it has to do with the attempt to gain life power for yourself in a way that God has not instituted. You try to get life power apart from the life-giver God. Does that make sense? Okay, the next one is a very, very common one across many societies. And if you were a bunch of Aboriginal pastors or evangelists, or if you were a bunch of Aboriginal women in Australia, I wouldn't have to explain this at all. They know it. Without explanation, it's taboo. You don't even talk about it. But everybody knows about it. Menstrual blood. Why is it that menstrual blood makes people unclean? Why is it that menstruation is, sexual intercourse is forbidden during menstruation? Let's see if you can work it out from what I've said. What? That's partly that. Yes, just say it louder, Bill.
It's the expunging of the life force from the body that's not come into the procreative process of the life itself, so it's getting rid of that, so it's dead.
It's, if you like, it's dead blood rather than alive blood. And life, it's not living blood, it's dead blood. Yes, it's partly that. Okay, what do you imagine, what ritual, religious use could people have with menstrual blood? Fertility, okay. Now, why would a man want to have sexual intercourse with a woman when she's menstruating, apart from, being randy or something like that? Why? And there's some societies where men quite deliberately have sexual intercourse with women during menstruation and don't have it during the regular time. What?
It doesn't reveal their impotence.
It doesn't reveal their impotence? Yeah, that could be that, but that's too Western. That's not the way they think. Yeah.
They gain the woman's life force?
They gain the woman's life force. You are stealing life power from that woman. And so no woman would want to have intercourse with a male during menstruation, because what's happening? That man is stealing something that's vital to her being as a woman from her. Okay? Do you see the way it works? It has spiritual significance. Or, take another case, what would women use menstrual blood to do? Yeah. In Aboriginal societies, some of the most powerful magic sorcery is done using menstrual blood. And if a woman wants to put a hex on somebody, what does she use? Menstrual blood. And if you know anything about the occult, you know that this is an important part of it. So why is it that God forbids sexual intercourse during menstruation? You can see why. Because it shuts the door to the occult and the misappropriation of life power, or the misapplication of life power. Let's just anything on those two. I've spent some time on that because you get lots of scholars and modern scholars and commentators on the Old Testament who just don't have a clue about this and ridicule this blind, primitive way of thinking. I'd like to expose some of them to live in an Aboriginal community for a year or two, or go up to the highlands of New Guinea and they'd learn a thing or two about that. Any questions?
You're going to do pork yet, right?
Yeah, you see it's up there. Okay, now the next one's very, very important for the Old Testament. As you know, the Israelites are forbidden to touch the corpse of a person who's died. And contact with the corpse renders a person, it's not a minor form of impurity. So, for example, if I have an emission of semen, then I'm unclean until sunset the next day and I just wash, and then it's a temporary state of impurity, very low-level impurity. But if I touch a corpse, even if it's for legitimate purpose like preparing the corpse for burial or actually carrying the corpse to be buried, that makes me unclean for 7 days. And I've got to wash my whole body at the end of it. Now, what is there about corpses that makes a corpse a means for the transmission of major impurity? Well, to make sense of that, you've got to go back into animist societies. Just a story, I could tell you a whole lot of stories, but I did promise. A cousin of mine was born in New Guinea in a place called Finschhafen. His parents, my uncle and aunt, were lay missionaries there, and they spent all their life working in the Lutheran Church of Papua New Guinea. He was born there, and then he has spent all of his working life working for the mission there. And he was in charge of the commercial arm of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Papua New Guinea. Now, he was born there, and if he was born there, where does his spirit come from? New Guinea. It doesn't come from his parents, it comes from that place. And they know where he was born, they know where he's conceived. Now, a few years ago, the word went out that he was about to retire. And some of the local people conspired to murder him. And as a result of it, he never announced his retirement. He left without letting anybody locally know that this was the last time he's going to be. He didn't say goodbye to the local people. He just left on what was ostensibly furlough and didn't come back. Now, this is the strange kind of thing that you come across if you're in these kinds of countries. something that doesn't make sense. The people loved him. He could speak the local languages. He worked well with them. And yet they wanted to murder him. Why? Right? So the Spirit would stay in Finchhafen. Now, why do they want his Spirit to stay there? What? Now, that's less direct, no, but is it because they can have more people, yeah?
They wanted to turn him into an ancestor so that he can continue to bless them.
You got it. If he was powerful and influential when he was half alive, now if you're, what's the problem? If you think in terms of power and in spiritual terms, what is it that limits my spirit? Is my body. Okay, now, which means that a person who, despite the body, achieves great things, is a big man, does great things, what's going to happen when that person dies? That person becomes more influential, more powerful, becomes an ancestor, one of the living dead, a source of blessing, a source of power for the living. He could do more for them dead than alive in our terms. Can you see the way I work?
So if he was not a very good citizen, they'd fake lie and go away. We don't want him to be, or would they do that with anybody regardless of stature within the community?
Yeah, that's right, because it's a big man society. It's your original prosperity success society, because your status depends on your success and your power. So the more wives you have, the more children you have, the more pigs you have, the higher your status, because that shows that you have got a powerful spirit. Or, can you see my work? Now, if you go to a village in New Guinea, a traditional pagan village, you go to a house, have a roof about this high, and then you have a forked ceiling like that, and then it's thatched. You have the living people down here. Do you know what you have up there in the ceiling? Not the spirits of the ancestors, the bones of your ancestors. They expose the body somewhere out in the bush, and then once the flesh is stripped of them, they gather the bones and they bring them back into the house. Now, why do they put them in the house?
Protect them. To protect them.
To protect them negatively, so it protects them from evil spirits. That's the negative side of it. Positively, what do the ancestors up there do? They bring blessing to you, good luck, prosperity. So, in most societies, traditional societies, there's a close connection between the reverence of the ancestors and spiritism. Can you see the link? Reverence of ancestors taps into the spirits of the ancestors. Now, for the Canaanite people, the corpse of a person, your relative who's died, is not unclean. In fact, what is it? It's holy. And it's the source of power and life. And so, for example, you have the bones of your ancestors up there. If you want to be in touch with your ancestors and want to get spirit power from them, what would you do? Touch the bones, because it links you with the spirits of the ancestors and brings good luck, protection, blessing. Now, this form of religion, which is basically animism, and is closely connected with spiritism and the occult, with the conjuring up, necromancy, the conjuring up of the spirits of the dead, is the pervasive religion in the ancient world. It's what Canaanite religion was basically about at its basic level. Now, why is it then that God forbids the Israelites to, not forbids them, why does God forbid contact with dead people? And can you see the results of it? Because it's associated with the occult. And by making that prohibition, he cuts the roots with animism, once and for all. By that simple prohibition, the whole religion of animism is removed, expunged from the community.
How about in the case of, I think it's in the Vatican, relics, and somewhere there's the bones of someone's dog, I don't know, St. Paul,
Yes.
St. Peter's. Is that kind of in the same?
It's in the same world, and it's
venerating the bones.
No, it's not venerating. Let's just not have hermeneutical suspicions. Let's throw away my Lutheran hat for a moment and consider it in its own terms. One of the surprising features that archaeologists have found is that it's common in the Greco-Mediterranean world for churches to be built on all places cemeteries. It's quite common for churches themselves to be burial places. You still get it in cathedrals in Europe. And in the old churches here in North America, where do you have the cemetery? Around the church, because the living and the dead are still part of the one congregation. Now, why is it that in the early church and in the Catholic Church to the present day, you get the cult of the dead, which is the cult of the relics? It's against this stuff, but it is the relics of the dead. If they are holy people, then the relics are dead, and they're a means of communicating God's holiness. That's the way it works. So it's within the same frame of reference. Now, don't take me wrong. I'm not saying this is right. I'm just saying that before you criticize something, you always need to understand it. If you're interested in this whole question of the cult of the saints, the cult of the dead, Raymond Brown has written a brilliant historical work called The Cult of the Dead, I think. It'll be in the same writing. Raymond Brown. If you just flip through it, you get lots of very interesting stuff, which explains a lot of this. Any other question on it? Okay, let's get to pigs. Okay, yes.
Would you refresh my memory on animism?
Animism comes from animus, which means spirit. Animism basically has the contention that reality is spiritual, and that everything that we have in creation has its spirit, and the spirit is the life force in it. This is good New Agey religion, by the way. A lot of New Age theology connects very closely to this. So what is it that makes that fir tree grow there? It's life force, it's spirit. There's some rocks out there. Those rocks have spirit in them. This place here has its own spirit. Every bird, every animal on this campus has its spirit. And we human beings are basically animated by our spirit, our life force, our nephesh in Hebrew, which is breath, life power. And so you have two worlds. They're not totally separate, but they are sort of two tiers. You have one reality. Let's just say that's the one reality. The base reality is spirit. The invisible world, that's where power is, that's where life is. And then you have the material world, which is not separate from it. They're not totally separate, but this is a manifestation of that. So what happens when you die? You move from being basically in this realm into this realm. You become pure spirit. You get rid of your body. You cease to be physical and you become pure spirit. You become a living spirit. Something else. Oh, yes, and in many animist societies, like Canaanite society, and
if we get time, we'll come to this in connection with atonement and the theology of atonement. What's the one physical thing that is both physical and spiritual? So you need to have bridges here between the two. The most obvious bridge between the two worlds is blood. It's physical and spiritual. And in terms of a few other things that I mentioned, particularly in Canaanite society, it's not in all animist societies, but what else that we mentioned links together this and this? Semen and menstrual blood. Well, that's just a connection. Actually, in ancient way of thinking, semen, menstrual blood are merely variations of this. They're different forms of life force, which is blood. So blood is the only substance that is both spiritual and physical. Yes, Richard.
Why doesn't Jesus in the New Testament continue prohibiting these things since there's animism around today also?
Yeah. Can I throw that back to the class? And this is one of the big differences. Can I make it more concrete? Why is it that when Jesus went to the village of Nain, and he saw the widow coming at the head of that funeral cortege, and her son was being brought out to be buried, and all the mourners were there, what did he do? He went out and touched the corpse. Why?
Yeah, because he's showing that he was over and above the fulfillment of the law. And
Well, he fulfills the law.
That he was going to bring about a whole new approach or covenant, or as you call it.
Yes, it is that.
That it was completely God's doing now, not man.
Yep. Something more concrete than that. All that's true, yes. He transferred his life-giving power to the corpse, and what did he take on himself? He took on impurity and death. So what? The incarnation of Jesus, as a flesh and blood human being, every time you see the word blood in the New Testament, stop and look closely. Something very significant is going on there. Remember that Hebrew says Jesus shared our blood and flesh. We would expect it the other way, flesh and blood, but he shares our blood and flesh. He is our blood brother. And he transforms everything by his incarnation, his sacrificial death, and above all, his resurrection. So what is it that changed in the early church? Why was it that churches were built on cemeteries? Now, according to the Old Testament, what kind of a place is a cemetery? Old Testament, no. Old Testament, cemetery is not a sleeping place, it's not a dormitory, that's Christian. It's an unclean place, and therefore what do? You avoid it, you stay away from it as much as necessary. Why was it that the early Christians built churches on cemeteries? Or why is it that on every Easter Sunday in Central Australia, our Lutheran Aboriginal brothers and sisters hold the Easter service in a strange place? They don't hold it in the church. Guess where they hold it? In the cemetery. Why? Because it has to do with resurrection, which changes everything. Now, there's a lot more there, Richard, to fill in the gaps, but that's the short answer. Now, yeah.
I'm trying to get a handle on the history of, like the time frame of when animism, I guess, began.
As far as we can gather historically, animism has always been, and it is still one of the... No, despite what you read in textbooks,
It's the pervasive religion. Across most cultures, there are a number of very sophisticated forms of animism that are basically built on animism. So, for example, Egyptian religion is built on an animist substructure. Canaanite religion is built on an animist substructure. But also, Hinduism is basically animism. It's a refined, sophisticated form of animism. And what comes out of Hinduism? Buddhism. Now with reincarnation, what's that about? Your spirit going, or the pre-existence of spirits, then going spiritual realm, and you become more and more spiritual until you become purely spiritual. It's basically a refined form of animism. And it's interesting, what I find as a scholar very, very interesting, is that you can't prove historically that there's any connection between religion of the tribes in Africa and the Aboriginal Australia. But if you study them, there's lots of variations, but basically this animist stuff is common. This is the basic template of African religions. I haven't been there, but talking to people reading about it, it's the template of Hinduism and people in India. It's the template of traditional people up in Papua New Guinea. Very strange phenomena that evolutionary historical scholars can't make sense of. Now, why is it that this is common across people? Okay, we as theologically we know. Oh, yes.
Why did they bring Jacob's bones out of Egypt?
Okay, now there's so much. There's lots of details which seem rather quaint to us, which have deep significance. Let me go even back further in Genesis than that, or that's Exodus, but those bones were supposed to be kept to be brought out and the important thing was not that they were brought out, but what does it go on to say?
Right, they're buried in Shechem.
That they were buried in Shechem. That's a significant detail. This is slightly off the mark, but I want to go all the way back to Abraham and do something very quickly. Do you know when God called Abraham, he told him, go, leave your what? Your land, your family, and your clan. Now the most important part of that was him leaving his land. Now if he leaves his land, his tribe basically, and his family, for a person in an animist world, what you're doing? Spiritually you commit suicide. You become a nobody. If an Aboriginal person leaves their home territory, in a sense they cease to exist spiritually. God was telling Abraham to commit spiritual suicide because through the land and family you have connection with your ancestors and you receive blessing from your ancestors. By leaving that, you cut yourself off from blessing. So he's told to cut himself off from those sources of blessing so that God could be his source of blessing. And you remember when he came to the land, and this is very significant for animist people, even though God promised him the land, how much land did Abraham have when he died?
A cemetery.
He had a cemetery. Remember the cemetery in Hebron? And even Isaac had no land and Jacob had no land. Now, however, for people in the ancient world, that cemetery, and for Jews to the present day, that cemetery is far more significant than just a place to dispose bodies, because that cemetery gives you a right to the land. You don't have land rights in the ancient world. You don't have land rights, titles of land in Aboriginal society, but your claim to the land is based on the graves of your ancestors. Where you bury members of your family, that's the land that that belongs to your family, and through that you get blessing. Now, you can work out for yourselves what the connection then is with Jacob being brought back to the land. It's because God promised the land to whom? Not Jacob, but Joseph. Yes?
I said Jacob.
Jacob, it meant it should have been Joseph. We're going very slowly, but this is, I'm explaining what people find most difficult in Exodus, is some of this stuff. And in itself, it's not all that significant to you. I don't know whether you regard it being significant, but if ever you work in these kinds of societies, you'll find it's immensely significant. Just very lastly, very quickly, why is it that pork is unclean? And why is it forbidden? Now, it's not explained, it's merely that God merely says it's unclean, don't eat it, it makes you unclean. Well, pigs in the ancient world were connected symbolically and ritually with the underworld like snakes. Snake is a symbol of evil, Satan, demons. And all the rituals in the ancient world that had to do with contacting and dealing with the spirits of the gods of the underworld, which is the occult, used pigs and pig's blood and involved the eating of pork. So it has a special significance in the ancient world. Now we had something similar to this, just on this, Old Testament. According to the ancient world, and this is so across most pagan religions, pagan people divide the gods into three classes. You know which three classes of gods there are? There's the sky gods, and then there are the earth gods. Well, sea is part of underworld. Sea, water, chaos. Okay? Now remember, in the Ten Commandments, God forbids the Israelites to make an image of anything that is in these three realms. Now the three classes of gods. The good gods, the gods that produce life and order, are the sky gods. They are predominantly male. The earth gods, what class would they be? What sex are they? Female. So Canaanite religion hovers around a god and a goddess. There's Baal, who's the sky god, who produces rain, thunder, whose symbol is the bull, and there's the Asherah, the earth mother, and Baal, when he inseminates the womb of the earth by sending rain. So you have sexual intercourse between Baal and Asherah. So earth gods are basically goddesses. There are some male, there are exceptions to this. And then the underworld gods are the nasties. These are the gods of order. These are the gods of chaos. Now, I'll have to leave it then because I've got into too much comparative religion stuff to go beyond that. Any questions on that?
Still don't have
Look,
an answer.
that's hieroglyphics, isn't it? Yes. Yes.
I still don't have the answer for why Jesus does, why the New Testament allows us to eat pork or do the other stuff there, if the animistic societies are still around.
Okay, then it depends on context. If you have, now the rule is, can I give you a case from Christian history which is quite different? Why is it that if you go to the supermarkets here in North America, you can buy pork, you can buy mutton, you can buy chicken, you can buy beef, but you can't buy horse meat to eat? Do you realise horse meat It's jolly good meat. Have any of you ever eaten it? I think I like it better than beef. Beef, it's not an old nag. But that applies to any animal. Why is it that we don't eat horse meat? If you go to other parts of the world, instead of it being despised, it's regarded as the best meat of all. You've got to pay the most for it. That's some parts of the Middle East and North China, Mongolia, Russia. Why is it? Well, it's for religious reasons. Our background, our religious background is Northern European, Indo-Germanic. And for Indo-Germanic people, the most important god of all is Thor. And the horse is sacred to Thor. And all the rituals that involve the worship of Thor, the main god of the Indo-Germanic, had to do with slaughtering and the eating of horse meat and the eating of blood from horses. And best meat, you use it always for ritual purposes. Can you imagine what happened when the Christian missionaries came to the German tribes and they were converted? What's one of the first things that they forbade their converts to do? Why forbid the horse meat? Because you can't start eating that meat without being drawn back into the whole pagan realm. Now, you have analogies to that in the missionary situation, and we don't have time because it goes way beyond Leviticus. I could give you examples from Aboriginal community of things that are forbidden for Aboriginal Christians, not because Europeans said so, but because they of the significance of this in their culture. Yes?
I was just thinking in answer to this question, two things were, God in Acts says all things are made clean.
Yes, that's part of it.
The second thing is Christ came to show what the kingdom of heaven was and gave us all an example of what the kingdom of heaven was like, and therefore did away with all these speculations and superstitions for the Christian faith.
Now that's the first part, yes. The second part, you're talking like a enlightened Westerner. All these superstitions, as if this is just nonsense, that there's no power here, there's no reality here. There is power, there is reality. What kind of spiritual reality is it?
Dark.
It's the dark reality.
And that's what he came to set free from.
And that's what he came to set free and to redeem the whole of creation. And that means redeeming even horse meat and pork. And so, for example, right from the beginning, astonishingly, whereas a woman during menstrual period couldn't visit the temple, from the very beginning, and you can see it already in 1 Timothy chapter 2, about a woman being kept safe or saved by childbearing, has to do with the things that have to do with childbearing, and my exegesis of it is that it refers to menstruation, and everything to do with menstruation and childbirth, and that menstruation doesn't disqualify a woman from what? Participating in the divine service and going to Holy Communion. You would have expected that coming from Jewish background. Christian women shouldn't receive the sacrament during menstrual period. In fact, that's a big problem up in New Guinea and in India, where because there hasn't been clear teaching on this, women stay away from Holy Communion during their period, because there hasn't been adequate catechization in this area. Let's have, yes. One last thing, okay? Spent a lot of time here. Any other questions just on this whole area? Yes?
It seems to me like maybe we could do it in the other order. Instead of this being forbidden because it's used by animists, it's used by animists because it's forbidden. That the power comes.
Yes, it works both ways. It's used by animists because it's forbidden. What lies behind it is misappropriation, misuse of God's gifts of creation.
real. Now, there's power there, but it's bad power, it's dark power, it's not good power. We do the same kind of thing abusing God's creation. And the whole Western technology and whole environmental crisis comes from the abuse of God's creation, which basically the same principle is involved there. Yeah, it works both ways. Anything else? Okay, just one last thing before we have a break. In the Old Testament, there are degrees of holiness. The closer you come to God, the holier you are. The further you go from God, the less you share in God's holiness. Now, the reverse happens, or the same thing happens with impurity. The further you are from God, the deeper you are into impurity. There are degrees of impurity. So, basically, there's three classes of impurity, which are codified by the rabbis. And if ever you read the Mishnah, they would say there's basically three classes of impurity. I won't go into the technical rabbinical terms. There's minor, there's serious, and then there is extreme pollution. Some things are minimally unclean and make you minimally unclean. So, for example, if I have an emission of semen tonight, then I'm unclean until tomorrow evening. However, menstruation is fairly mild, low-level uncleanness. Now, why would it run for 7 days when sexual emission only runs for 1 day? It's the length of the cycle. And what's important in these 7 days is not the 6th day, but is the last day, which marks the end of the menstrual cycle. And a woman then is required to take a bath at the end of the menstrual period. So the 7 days corresponds to the 7 days of the menstrual period, and the prohibition of those 7 days makes it impossible for an Israelite male to have sex during that menstrual period, so that they don't get sucked back into that animist world and begin to misuse sexuality. Okay, we'll take a break there, and you can make up again.
Would that be the same thinking behind Paul in Romans 1, where he's saying, talking about the 3 stages of people falling away from God?
Absolutely, it's all in the same way. Yep. And you get the same thing in 1 Corinthians 11 with desecration. You get, that's why some are weak, some are sick, some who die. Hopefully you get the stage. That's rabbinical reflection on. You can find the antecedents in the Old Testament for that.
You probably have time I deal with that in the comments and get that for you. Okay. No, it'll take us two minutes worth.
Hi, I'm John Zorko, and I've never met you before, but I did the commentary on Philemon. So, thank you. Well, likewise. I was listening to, I've taught myth, classical mythology.